Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar entitled Compassion Revolution, Understanding and Responding to the Dalai Lama's Vision. My name is Brendan Ozawa da Silva, and I am an associate teaching professor here at the University at the Emory Compassion Center. And I will serve as moderator for our webinar today. 25 years after the founding of the Emory-Tibet Partnership, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's entreaty for the world to focus on compassion has never been stronger. Recently, the Dalai Lama has called for a compassion revolution, saying, we need a compassion revolution, and we need it now. What does the Dalai Lama mean by compassion revolution, and how might we help to bring it about? That is our question for this hour. Here with us to address this and to highlight the work of Emory's Compassion Center in responding to the Dalai Lama's challenge is an august panel, each a scholar, author, and leader in the field of compassion and its cultivation. Dr. Susan Bauer Wu, president of the Mind and Life Institute and author of the recent book, A Future We Can Love, How We Can Reverse the Climate Crisis with the Power of Our Hearts and Minds. Dr. Daniel Goleman, author of many books, including the bestseller Emotional Intelligence, as well as A Force for Good, the Dalai Lama's Vision for Our World. And Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi, Executive Director of the Center for Contemplative Science and Compassion-Based Ethics here at Emory, and developer and author of the Cognitively Based Compassion Training Program. I'd also like to note that Dr. Goleman and Dr. Bauer Wu are longtime friends and supporters of the Emory Compassion Center. So thank you so much for being with us again. We will hear from each of our distinguished panelists for the first half hour or so, and then we will have an open conversation for the second half. During that second half, we will take questions from you, our viewers. So if you have a question for our panelists, please submit it at any time during this broadcast, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Now to open, perhaps we can start with you, Dr. Goleman. Your acquaintance with the Dalai Lama goes back. You have studied his life and thought closely, written about him, and conversed with him many times over the years, especially on the convergence of science and spirituality. How are we to understand the Dalai Lama's call for a compassion revolution? What does he mean by the words compassion and revolution?
Well, my sense is that the Dalai Lama means something a little different than we might assume. First, let's look at what we mean by compassion. Often we make the mistake that empathy is the same as compassion. It's not. It's a prerequisite. Consider there's a spectrum that goes from being totally self-absorbed in our own thoughts to noticing other people, to tuning into other people. That's where empathy comes in. Seeing if they need our help in any way, and then taking compassionate action. So there's a series of steps we need to take, and His Holiness recognizes that. He also said, I remember back in the 80s, he said, you need a new word in English. Compassion in your language implies for other people, but what about self-compassion? In my language, it includes myself as well as others. And so he recommended that we coin a word, self-compassion, which now actually is a subject of intense research. But in the 80s, that was a new idea. He also questioned the use of compassion as simply being nice, which is another assumption that we make too easily in our culture. He said compassion can be assertive. Compassion can mean bringing up something that needs to be dealt with rather than just being nice to create a harmony. So basically, he sees compassion in, I'd say, a more holistic way than we tend to think of it in English. He also, when he talks about revolution, what I think he means, and this is my guess, is that our systems, our economy, our politics, the systems that really define our lives are based on what he would see as greed, aversion, and essentially ignorance. For example, we don't know the ways in which the things we buy and use every day are destroying the environment for us, for our children and grandchildren. And there's a huge ignorance. At any rate, I think he means replacing those basic motives with compassion, with caring about other people. So uh, I was really a bit surprised when I wrote the book A Force for Good with him for his 80th birthday to realize that he's an activist. He, first of all, he sees kindness, which is another way of talking about compassion, as a unifying commonality in all major religions, but he doesn't use a religious base. He uses a scientific base because people are born compassionate. Infants are compassionate. We tend to lose this as we go to school, but essentially uh, children come into the world because of compassion and exhibit it at first. He thinks it's really there. His compassion, I would say, is kind of muscular. I was a little surprised by this, but for example, when we talked about economics, he said, the gap between rich and poor, which has grown steadily over centuries, is obscene. It's a crime. He really favors an economic system where there is a more even playing field. That's a little revolutionary, I would say. But beyond a compassionate economy, he, of course, says we should help those in need. That's everyday compassion. But he says the ultimate compassion is helping them help themselves, not making them dependent on the person who's helping. The environment is another area where he's quite concerned and would be an activist if he weren't constrained by the role of the Dalai Lama. He says, the earth is our home and the earth is on fire. And we're going to hear more about that from Susan Bauer Wu, who's just written a wonderful book about a future we can love rather than one that scares us. And then finally, when it comes to war and conflict, he takes the position that one day, eventually, we should change what's now open conflict and war to dialogue, and to dialogue which hears both sides and prevents the war in the first place. And in today's world, that may seem naive, but he sees it as a long-term plan. Finally, he really advocates what he calls an education of the heart. This is what sea learning is all about. It's teaching kids an ethic of caring along with the basics, teaching them tools for self-mastery, for compassion. If this became standard in our education, I think systems would change from within. They change spontaneously. And finally, he says, look, take a long view. His view is over centuries. Don't be frustrated by what you can't do. Think about what you can do. And he urges each of us to act in any way we can. He says, acting together, we can reinvent the future.
Thank you so much, Dan, for those inspiring words. You've given us a lot to think about, and a perfect setup also for your comments, Susan. Susan, you have a long history also as a scholar of contemplative science. For the last 8 years, you've been president of the Mind and Life Institute, which for 35 years has fostered a dialogue between contemplatives and scientists. It's an organization that was co-founded by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So you have been able to see the field of contemplative science grow. And moreover, for you, this isn't just a theoretical, academic, or scientific enterprise. It's one very tied to the most pressing issues of our day, including activism. Dan made reference to your recent book, which was inspired by a meeting between the Dalai Lama and Greta Thunberg with climate scientists on climate change. So from your perspective, what is your understanding of the Dalai Lama's call for compassion? And also, I'd like to ask you, what gives you hope from your experiences that we might answer this call in some meaningful way?
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Geshe for your continued good work. Thank you. And great to be with you again, Dan. Yeah. Well, the Dalai Lama, and Dan, you may remember this, but it was around, my understanding was around 25 years ago. And he was with scientists who were engaged in the early work of contemplative science. And it seemed like a lot of the work at that time was focused on destructive emotions. And in fact, the book Destructive Emotions, which Dan, you wrote, that was really inspired by the Mind and Life dialogue on that topic of destructive emotions. I think that was in 2000, was about, these unwholesome emotions that actually can trigger us and actually interfere with our ability to be compassionate. And so he had a plea for the scientists and said, you know, I want you to think about emotions that are not necessarily destructive, and to look at those that are more wholesome, like compassion, like love and generosity. And that was really a spark of bringing these positive, wholesome, pro-social qualities into the field of contemplative science. His Holiness did that, and now there's a whole body of work that is on that topic. And in fact, Mind and Life, 7 years ago, we started a new research grants program called the Peace Grants, which stand for pro-social, empathy, altruism, compassion, and ethics. And we've been funding a number of studies all over the world in that area. And we're looking at both the mechanisms as well as ways to cultivate compassion and other wholesome qualities. And that has also sparked another grants program that's more of changemaker grants, and they're called the Contemplative Changemaking Grants, looking at community-based projects to cultivate compassion. So His Holiness, you know, sparked that. And so within the field of contemplative science, he's absolutely created a compassion revolution. And also has really encouraged me and my colleagues at Mind and Life to look at the areas that we focus on. And so we've moved beyond a major focus on individual well-being and stress reduction and just understanding what areas of the brain, you know, light up, but to actually expand that to look at compassionate communities and human earth connection. And the human earth connection is what sparked, you know, the real interest in us having the event with the Dalai Lama and Greta and the climate scientists, and then the book that followed. So, and I think about human earth connection and compassionate communities, it's really looking at others with compassionate eyes, and that we see ourselves in the other. And that includes those who are different than us, who look different than us, who think differently than us, different species. So, you know, land animals, sea animals, insects, and then even the plant kingdom and trees and plants, because we are the other. We share air that actually comes from the oxygen we breathe, comes from the plant kingdom, and the food we eat is who we are. We are totally interconnected, embedded with every other living being. You know, we're not separate from that. And so when we can really see that, I think there would not be polarization. There wouldn't be war. We'd be creating more loving and compassionate communities. And together we will be rising to the occasion to address the climate emergency. And I've moved from calling it a climate crisis to a climate emergency, because as His Holiness says, in our only home, we all share this one atmosphere, which is our only home, is on fire, like literally on fire. And we all have to rise to the occasion. So if we really could tap into our own compassion, we will actually begin to make these big and little decisions that we make every day with more compassionate eyes and behaviors. So I'll just share with you one other thought as it relates to the climate emergency. And there's a person who I talk about in the book, and she's a scientist at the University of Oslo, and her name is Karen O'Brien. And she's written about and has studied something called quantum social change. And it's kind of a modeled after quantum theory in physics. And it's essentially boils down to how each of us has a sphere of influence. And that can be people who are directly in our lives as well as the ripples. And I think that with social media and the digital age that we're in, we actually have the ability to positively influence a lot of people. And so to me, a compassion revolution also connects really beautifully with this idea of quantum social change. And I'll end with one example, and it is, there are many. I'll just say that there's a lot of good stuff that's happening all over the world. And you know, what you're doing here at Emory is just one example of it, but there's amazing activists going on. But I'm going to share an example that I describe in the book, and I come back to really, I'm personally inspired by it. And it's this woman, many of you may know Wangari Maathai, and she is no longer alive, but she actually received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. And Wangari, when she graduated from college, so she grew up in Kenya, and she was taught by her elders to really appreciate and to sense the sacredness of the natural world. And there was a tree, like a grandmother tree, that was on the property where she grew up. And that tree had roots that connected to the water system, and it created food and created livelihood for the women and the people. And she went to college, she came back to her homeland, and the tree was dead, and the water was dried up. And the families were starving because they didn't have, you know, the water to be able to cultivate the crops. And essentially what she did was to gather a small group of people, like half a dozen women in her local community, to collect native seeds from the trees in the Karuna forest. And from there, they started planting native trees. And now there have been, you know, hundreds of millions of trees that have been planted, and it started what's called the Green Belt movement. And I share that as just an example. I mean, she was a recent college graduate who just was really, really touched. Her heart was open to wanting to make a difference in her local community. And that local community ended up becoming an international movement. So.
Thank you, Susan. That is a beautiful story and a very hopeful one about how even an individual can make a significant difference. You alluded to Dan's book, also his writings in his book, A Force for Good. I remember in reading that book, Dan, thinking, A Force for Good, it's a book on the Dalai Lama. The title, Force for Good, must mean the Dalai Lama, Force for Good. And then as I read it, I realized that it was actually the Dalai Lama saying that each one of us can be a force for good. Yeah. And what a hopeful message. You also mentioned Susan Dan's book, Destructive Emotions, which I actually encountered in about 2001. And it was reading that book, Dan, that actually got me interested in the whole field of contemplative science. So thank you for that. And there was a mention in that book about bringing this into education. Mark Greenberg was one of the participants there, who's actually here at Emory this week with us. And so I'd like to turn now to Geshe Lobsang, because this week here at Emory University, we celebrate the 25th year anniversary of our university's relationship with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who served as a presidential distinguished professor here, a position he graciously accepted in 2007. The Emory Compassion Center grew out of that relationship and now seeks to answer the Dalai Lama's call for a compassion revolution through practical programs for teaching, nurturing, and cultivating compassion, both for adults and for school children in educational systems around the world. So, Geshe, perhaps you could share with us, how is your work and the work of the center trying to answer the Dalai Lama's call for a compassion revolution in concrete ways?
Thank you, Brendan. And let me begin by first extending our deep gratitude from everyone here at Emory Compassion Center, to Dan and to Susan for being here for this webinar. We draw from your vision, from your guidance. We have benefited for many years for our work here. Yes, we are celebrating the 25-year since the founding of Emory-Tibet Partnership, which His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself inaugurated in 1998. For me, when we look back these 25 years, it really has been guided by the vision of His Holiness. In fact, when he inaugurated this partnership, he also gave the commencement speech at Emory University for the graduating students. And his message for the students, among others, one of the key messages was that the education is an instrument. Whether such an instrument is used for constructive purpose or not depends on the user. If the person has a warm heart, a compassionate heart, then such a person would put that education for the constructive purpose. And that was really where we, as a center, which was established with the vision for the bridging the two worlds for one common humanity, the world of Tibetan spirituality, if you will, the spiritual world, the philosophy, the contemplative science, with the modern science and education. Over the years, we have attempted to respond to His Holiness's vision, this vision for bringing two worlds together. And of course, one way is to bring the modern science to the Tibetan monastic education, in the hope that when the monastics are equipped with the science, tools of the science, they are familiar with the science concepts, but also how to do research and so forth, they will be able to meet the scientists on the equal footing in advancing the knowledge that could be quite revolutionary in many ways, where this contemplative knowledge can come together with the scientific insights that are unfolding, and through that work, we can have a more holistic understanding of human condition. But the large part of our work also is to how to bring what the Tibetan or Indo-Tibetan contemplative tradition has to offer to the world. And that is where I think that His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he called for a spiritual revolution back in 1999, when he wrote the book, The Ethics for the New Millennium, he said that we need a revolution, not the economic or the political, but the spiritual revolution. And the spiritual revolution, what he meant by it is the revolution of the bringing basic human values into our education and into our lives, private and public domain. And that's where he also articulated this need to bring compassion and other values into education. In fact, both of you know well, but some of our audience may not be familiar with. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has 4 major commitments in life, and one of them, perhaps the first one, in fact, the first commitment that His Holiness has in life is to ensure the continued survival and flourishing of the humanity, to bring basic values, promote basic human values like compassion. Compassion, it's, then you mentioned about the compassion, is not a kind of simple construct. It's a quite complex and multidimensional, psychological state. But when the Buddha, for example, he has said that if you have one virtue, one quality in your hand or in your palm, what is that quality that if you have it, all other qualities will be in your hand. And he says that it is compassion. The compassion, His Holiness also says that it grows from various qualities like respect for each other, our sense of oneness of humanity, the shared human recognition of our shared human condition and our interdependence. We live in a very, inextricably interdependent world. And that through this, we can have a more compassionate heart for others. But it's also the compassion, this warm-heartedness. At the core of compassion, the way that His Holiness understands from his tradition, is the warm-heartedness, sewa in Tibetan, which refers to endearment or tenderness, warm-heartedness. And if you relate to someone with this warm-heartedness, of course, then you would be more generous, you would be more patient, you would be more understanding, less judging, more helping, all the other virtues of the qualities. You can see that how this compassionate heart can support. So that's why when His Holiness says that his first commitment is to promote basic human values, particularly bringing in education. I think education is a powerful tool. When you, so then both of you mentioned about this long-term kind of endeavor, long-term goal, to really make a change on a cultural level. I think that the education is the way to go, the way you can have from pre-K through higher education, where students have the opportunity to explore, not just with teachers feeding that compassion is good, but to facilitate in a ways that they can come to realize, recognize the value of kindness, the compassion. But then, related to that also is that how do we go about promoting compassion? It's one thing to say that we need compassion and that, but is compassion something that can be taught? Is it a skill? And many scholars, including Dr. Richie Davidson, who has led the research in this field, as he and Danny yourself have consistently mentioned that compassion is a skill that can be learned, that can be expanded. And that's what at Emory University, I think that being an academic institution, our center, Compassion Center, being a part of this academic institution, this is what we attempt to bring this in the kind of training or the curriculum-based learning. So C-learning, social, emotional, and ethical learning, very much drawing from your work and His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many others, it's a way to systematically provide the curriculum that can systematically teach students how to go about cultivating social, emotional, ethical skills, compassion being the container. But the compassion is something that we need to bring this to the adult population, as both of you mentioned, that our world, this small blue planet, fragile planet, is our only home, as His Holiness says, and it's on fire. Of course, so many crises that we are seeing, whether the mental health crisis, whether it's the growing divide between rich and poor, or the political lines, and all artificial divides that we create, and the environmental crisis itself. I think that the planning or the need to expand, we all have compassion, the need to expand compassion, embody compassion at some level, is not just for the students, but for adults that we have now, whether it's the health professionals, the politicians, the leaders in the business sector or the education and other sectors of the human society. So at a Compassion Center, we have this umbrella initiative called the Compassion Shift, advancing the global culture of compassion. It's in response to His Holiness's call for this compassion revolution, bringing this two-pronged kind of approach to advancing compassion. One, by systematically bringing in education in the classroom through the curriculum development, which we have now for K through 12, but then also developing a compassion program for adults that can be offered in a relatively shorter period, like the cognitively based compassion training that we have developed here at Emory University. And that's also, we are now scaling it by tailoring to healthcare and the business and leadership, educators, as well as the other sectors like with the human health. So this is something that we are embarking, and to some degree of success, largely thanks to His Holiness's vision and support, but also the guidance of people like Dan, yourself, Susan, and many others. And we hope that these efforts can make a small contribution. You're absolutely right, so that there are so many people, so there are so many programs in the world, and we have, one organization with 30 or so people now, drawn to this vision of His Holiness for making a more compassionate world. And this is our small contribution, and we hope that this will continue for at least another 25 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Geshe Lobsang. Now, I'd like to open things up for general conversation. Perhaps there are some thoughts among the three of you from what you've heard.
I have a question for Dan.
Sure.
Yeah. So you've been deeply engaged with education work for decades, and we're one of the founders of social emotional learning, and you've seen the field change over time. And so those young children who are young children in the beginning, the early days of SEL, are now adults. And I'm curious of either what your vision was and or how you see the impact of the work of social emotional learning, and now what C-learning is about, social emotional ethical learning, really embodying and bringing in the compassionate heart. So I just would, walk us through a little bit of the history and maybe some of the accomplishments that you feel like have made a difference.
Well, the organization, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, was actually founded before my book, Emotional Intelligence. Back then, we were thinking of it as emotional literacy. And I have to say, I was not the key player. There was a team. The Collaborative was founded by a group of maybe 7 or 8. And I'm glad that Mark Greenberg is one of your advisors. He was critical. He had one of the pilot programs before what we call SEL. There were a couple of them. There was one at New Haven that was designed by people at Yale, and Roger Weisberg, who designed that program, eventually became one of the leaders of CASEL, which moved with him to University of Illinois in Chicago. And the initial idea was that the standard educational model didn't serve kids that well because it ignored emotions and their social reality, which for kids is immense. And that paying attention to that and helping kids get better at it would serve them in their lives. And in fact, we found that when programs, and now there are probably, 100, and it's worldwide, come to a school, these classes, which might be, 10 minutes on a Tuesday, become the favorite of the kids because it deals with things that they care about, what matters to them, their emotional life, their social life. And the idea is that over the course of their life, this will serve them well. And I have to say there's too little longitudinal research, Susan, to answer this from a data point of view, but we do have some data points. We know, for example, that if kids develop what's called cognitive control, that's the ability to handle your disruptive emotions, your disturbing emotions and not let them overwhelm you. Cognitive control comes online in terms of brain development between 5 and 7. And that's the difference between kindergartners and third graders. It's immense. But at any rate, having that ability predicts that you'll live longer, you'll be healthier, you'll make more money, if that's the barometer that matters to you. But also, I love this next generation, which sea learning embodies, because it brings compassion and ethics into the teaching. And as you mentioned, these are all learnable skills, but it's learned in daily life. For example, think of the difference between asking your kid when they come home from school, the difference between saying, how'd you do on the test, and who were you kind to today? That's a completely, radically, revolutionarily different way of thinking about what school can be. And I find it very exciting. And I do think that changing kids' attitudes, kids' skill set has a lifelong consequence. And this is a strategy for a compassion revolution. Thanks for asking, Susan.
We are very fortunate to have here at Emory a student who took some compassion training courses with us when she was 6 years old
Really?
at a local school here in Atlanta. Her name's Kitty Graham. And when we were bringing, under Geshe Lobsang's direction, compassion training, seeing if we could do this with very young children, she was in one of the first three classes that we visited. And I taught her for about 3 months back at that time. 12 years later, in 2001, she reached out and said, hey, I don't know if you remember me. And she included a little picture of herself, what she looked like when she was 6 years old. And we got back in touch, and she had said that she had spent the last 15 years training to be a ballerina, and her whole family had moved to New York for her to be a ballet dancer. And right when she was ready to audition, COVID hit. And there were no more practices, no more auditions, none of the companies were hiring. And she had to give up on her dream of being a ballet dancer.
So it was 2021.
2021, sorry,
Yeah,
I
okay.
misspoke, yes. And she said, and her mother came on the Zoom call too, to talk about how learning about compassion and mindfulness when Kitty was 6 years old had changed not only Kitty's life, but the whole family, and how it allowed them during this tragic time when she had to give up on her dream and her family had to give up on her dream, she was able to just see the positive side of it. And part of that positive side was, well, if I don't go to be a ballet dancer, I can go to college and I can go to Emory and I can study compassion and secular ethics at Emory. And so she has been in our classes here at Emory. And it's just one person, but an incredible story of the impact that it can have on a 6-year-old's life. And I remember her, even when she was 6, sitting at the front of the class and talking about using meditation to help her with her stress, how stressful ballet was even for her as a 6-year-old.
Yeah, it reminded me of how these practices can be really life-changing for individuals, but also at an organizational level. You know, in India, we have our Sea Learning and Compassion, CBCT, partner, Piramal Foundation. It's one of the foundations that has for last 17, 18 years committed themselves to really, bringing social help in social change, in education, in the healthcare and others. And about 2 years ago, they brought CBCT, this cultivating compassion training, to one of the hospitals. Bihar state in India is one of the poorest state, and within that there is a district called Sitamarhi, and the public hospital there, it's just with apparently total chaos. And this foundation, Piramal Foundation, they sent their what they call the Gandhi Fellows, who were trained in the CBCT, but also in the Sea Learning, and they went there and they provided this training to the entire staff, from janitors to the CEO, and they together, as they work for several months, within a year and a half, I had the opportunity to visit this hospital in May earlier this year. What a transformation! The nurses, the doctors, everyone said that it's a difference of day and night, and that really is also, and so much so that this hospital was recognized by the state, one of the most developed, and also received an award from the federal government as well. So I see that compassion, which has to do with the human connection, the genuine human connection. I think this is why when His Holiness says that this is a necessity, not a luxury, but a necessity for our survival, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
We have a question, and just a reminder to everyone that we are taking questions for the remainder of this hour, so feel free to write in the chat or use the Q&A function if you have a question for our panelists. This is a question from a C-learning teacher, Jillian. Hello, Jillian. Jillian's actually one of our champion C-learning teachers, so thank you for watching. And she asked the question, students sometimes struggle to apply the skills they learn in C-learning in real life. One factor I'm struggling with that could contribute is the culture of individualism. How do educators undo this me mentality that is perpetuated by the media, even their own family, etc.? How do we help children weigh the complex needs of everyone involved in a conflict and come to a resolution that may not be the most comfortable for them personally? Any thoughts on that?
I hear at least two questions in that question. One of them is, what can an individual child, for example, do in operating within a larger society that may not value some of these ethical principles like compassion? And the second is, what can we do about self-interest as a driver? And I think, let me speak to the second first. When His Holiness calls for a compassion revolution, he's talking about having a larger interest, caring about the greater good, not just oneself. Remember, when he talks about compassion, of course, it is oneself, but not at the expense of others. And our society, the competitiveness that, by the way, I think is instilled from first grade on. Richard Davidson, who's been mentioned, who's a neuroscientist, has data showing that children in the preschool years are quite compassionate naturally, but they lose that as they go into school. And then it becomes about how well am I doing? It becomes a competitive race. So I think that teaching a larger sense of what matters, that it's not just me, but it's everyone else too, is a revolutionary act. And it's never comfortable at first to be someone who's the first changer. So this is speaking to the first question. I think that the children who come out of these programs who have such values may be encountering a larger social realm that doesn't share those values particularly, but that's part of the challenge.
I'd like to add something, and it's just a combination of a reflection and a question, and anybody can answer it. Dan, your question, when you spoke earlier, you said, well, what if when a child came home from school, parents said, instead of what was your grade on the exam, on the test, to share an example of when you were kind today, right? Like that's huge, right? It's really, so my question is, and I know you're doing CBCT with professionals, and there's work being done with teachers, extensive work that's being done with teachers, but are there programs that are actually targeting parents? Because it seems that parents matter a lot. And that simple question when a child comes home and sitting at the dinner table, or, so just curious. And if not, maybe somebody will be inspired to do more work in that area.
Actually, Susan, I'm glad you brought that up. The research that the Chicago group did about these kinds of school courses found that the best ones included classes or programs for parents as well as kids. There's another way this works. That is, when you change a child's attitude, that child goes home and talks about it to the family. That has an effect on the family too.
Thank you, Dan, for these 2 points that you make. It's really, that has been our experience with C learning. Certainly, when first of all, there have been many occasions where the children, when they got C learning in their class, and they were the ones to tell their parents if they were a little stressed, take a deep breath, or even bringing the certain perspective shifts, like looking from another angle and like that. But for parents, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, that the best way to really to teach is by embodying it. I think that we can tell, for hours what the importance and how you do it like that. But if it doesn't match with our actions, then children are smart. They really did. So that's why that providing this to parents is really important. And at C learning here at our center, one of the works that we are doing is to also create some resources for the parents so that they become familiar with this C learning and the compassion, and in that way, not only they embody. Vast majority of people embody compassion, but it's when they are in difficult situation, that's when. But then they can also see what their children are learning in school, so they can be a seamless kind of the flow from the school and to the home.
Geshe, can I ask you a question?
Please.
Yeah, I'm very I'm kind of intrigued by your taking these programs to adults, to organizations, as you were mentioning the hospital in Bihar. In my own research and anecdotally, in speaking around the world, I've asked this question. What are the characteristics of a boss that you've had that you hated and one you loved? And you make the point that, as the Buddha said, I guess, if you have compassion, then that includes all the other virtues, or paramitas maybe is what he said. But at any rate, what I found was that basically they're describing a compassionate, a caring boss when they talk about one they love. And there are three kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, knowing how people think, and emotional, how they feel, and then concern, caring about them. And those are instantiated in different parts of the brain, we think. But at any rate, it's the boss who has that third part, the concern that people feel engaged, feel motivated by, inspired by, they have less turnover. These are all things that organizations want. And are you getting much traction, or is this just a plan going into the future? I'm kind of really excited by the fact you're doing this or thinking of it. Where does it stand?
Thank you, Dan, for asking this question. Actually, here at Emory University, at the medical school, we began about 10 years ago, actually, 2013 to be precise. The dean of the medical school, Chris Larson, that he actually saw the need to bring this human element, where not just the boss, but the colleagues, that when they interact with each other, there is a certain degree of respect and civility. And he is invited us to bring CBCT to them, and it has really kind of spoke to the community here, so much so that right now, if you think about one of the senior associate deans of the medical school, Dr. Bill Ely, he not only went through this, but also went through the teacher certification program, and now he's teaching. I'm actually co-teaching with him to the doctors and the faculty, and it's so amazing, that how they relate to so rightly so, because there's a huge struggle among them for the burnout and the compassion, which fundamentally come down to this warm-hearted connection with each other. It seems like that this really speaks to them, and it's very rewarding to see that. I think it works, and I'll just say very briefly, compassion, since it has to do with the basic human connection and that warm-heartedness, that should promote trust and cooperation, which is essential for an organization. Barry Webmeyer, you may have heard of this organization. The CEO of that, Bob Chapman, he just brought one thing. It's for his team, the leaders, to have their full kind of provide them the full commitment that they have the back of those people under their care. And that changed the organization, not just one, many businesses that they purchased, they bought, that were at the brink of kind of collapse, to transforming into a very, very robust, caring, functional, cooperative organization where the individuals flourish and the business, bottom line also is great. So I think that compassion is that, when His Holiness says that if you want to be happy, practice compassion. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. It really makes sense.
Let me give you 2 data points you can use in the class. One is a study that shows that if a patient feels the doctor cares about them, they're more compliant. The success of treatment depends not just on what medicines, say, a doctor prescribes, but whether the patient takes it. And compliance means yes, they do. So a caring, compassionate doctor gets better compliance.
Yes.
Yes.
We have a question that's very relevant to this discussion, perhaps from a medical professional. It has to do with the idea of do we have time for compassion? And Susan, you talked about the climate emergency, not even climate change. And so this is a common question that, maybe if we had time, compassion is a nice idea, but we don't have that time. This question says, in emergency medicine, time is of the essence, and there is not much of it. Compassion is sometimes viewed as a bolt-on to care when time allows for it. How does one bring compassion to encounters that are pressured and cognitively dense in terms of decision-making? Susan.
I'll jump in. Do you know, I come from a background in healthcare,
Absolutely.
and my first career was in that area. And bottom line, it doesn't take any more time to be present and to have a compassionate presence. It does not take more time. It's how we show up. It's not what we do, it's how we do it. And I do think that one way to change, sort of have a paradigm shift, particularly in nursing and medical education, is to be able to integrate these practices and not only practices, but these perspectives, and really helping to cultivate a foundation of compassionate and mindful presence. If we do that, then when they're in these really intense situations, healthcare is very, very challenging today. And working in the emergency critical care, as this person is, you have to be on your game. You absolutely have to be on your game. And so self-care, self-compassion is really important. And then just having these tools that are right there, they become embodied, they become part of who you are. So you don't have to think about doing it. It is just an extension already of who you are and how you do it and how you show up. So I've seen that happen. I know it's possible to do that, but we have to prioritize this, in education as well as in these settings. The other thing as it relates to compassionate eyes is helping the healthcare professionals to be really present to their colleagues, to notice the signs of when colleagues are really burning out or they're short fused and they're actually creating or contributing to a toxic environment that's ultimately going to cause harm to patients and families. And so there are ways to be able to bring that, into the work and of working with colleagues to create a culture, basically a culture of care, a culture of compassion, and a culture of mindful presence.
Yeah, so there is a social, cultural, and systems context as well, because to the individual physician or nurse who doesn't have the mental space because they don't have the time, because it's so pressurized, it's a lot of burden to place on their shoulders and say, well, it doesn't take any more time, you can always be present, but you're also talking about the social elements of other people supporting you, other people noticing that, trying to establish that culture that creates the mental space for that person to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I'll share an example, that when I was at the University of Virginia, and they were really cultivating this culture of care within the medical system. And essentially, it's like if you notice your colleagues are really not showing up in the ways that the patient really needs them to, actually calling a quick huddle and saying, let's just come together. Let's just take a few breaths together. Let's just ground. Is there anything I can do for you right now? Maybe you need to, take a break. I'll take over. And so it's not just about the individuals, but we do need to be looking at the overall systemic issues as well.
I'm sure then you have insight for this, but I just said briefly, there's a book called Compassionomics, and this is a book on how compassion, matters in the healthcare. And it's a brilliant, based on research, 225 peer-reviewed articles and all this. Stephen Tertiak, the author of the book, he says that compassion, it's really, all it takes is 40 seconds. That if we can take 20-some seconds or so to listen to what patient is saying, all it takes is about 29 seconds for someone to complete what's going on, and then 10-11 seconds to say something meaningful. And it may even be gesture, it comes in how we look at it, on our voice, perhaps how we interact, touching and so forth. And so compassion, sometimes we think that it's something, it has to be something, really a grand experience. But I think, as certainly you were saying, and Brandon both, if supported by the environment and the person development, I think these manifest in very kind of small ways that can make a big difference to the patient.
Right, just to Susan's point, any of us who have been patients, and we all have in one way or another, know the difference between a physician or a nurse who's warm or cold. It's tone of voice, it's facial expression, it's communicated all the time. And Susan, I think you're absolutely right that while you're doing whatever you need to do medically, you can be there, you can be present in a warm way.
Thank you all so much. I am very regretful to inform you all that we are at the end of our hour. And we actually, I see on the screen, we have 43 questions that are in the queue. So my apologies to all of you. We could have gone on for many more hours, of course, but we only have this 1 hour with these incredible speakers and panelists. Thank you so much to our distinguished panel. Thank you for being with us, Dan, Susan, and Geshe. Thank you to all our viewers for tuning in for this. Please be aware that this is one of a whole smorgasbord of events here for our 25th anniversary of the Emory-Tibet Partnership and the Compassion Center. So please be sure to check out the other events. You can find them on our website at compassion.emory.edu for the full schedule. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.